On today's episode of Faith in Focus, I am going to talk about kind of a lot of random stuff, just things I've been thinking about. It was spurred on by a podcast I listened to, and just some other thoughts of things that I've heard the past couple of weeks. I'm going to try to tie it all together into some kind of cohesive thread. We'll see what happens. It may just be an episode of rambling about sin and human depravity. So we'll see what happens. I hope you enjoy it. Hey guys, you may not know this, but Faith in Focus is just a small part of the ministry I do with InFaith. I also offer biblical counseling services, as well as serving as one of the staff counselors for InFaith as a mission. I teach the Bible at my local church, and I lead a Bible study in my home once a week. Your generous donations allow me to do all of this ministry. However, I would love to do it full time, which would mean being able to offer more counseling and Bible classes, as well as record more episodes of Faith in Focus. If you want to become a monthly supporter of this ministry, you can go to stopsmallcon.com, which will redirect you to my personal InFaith page, or you can text the word discipleship to 41444. That's discipleship, DISCIPLESHIP, to 41444. And you will receive a link to give, or you can email me at dennissotheby@infaith.org if you have any questions on becoming a monthly partner. Thank you, and let's get into the show. All right, and as I said in the opening, I don't necessarily have a plan for this episode. I mean, I do. I have notes, and I have some Bible verses pulled up. But I don't necessarily know exactly what it is that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about several different things, and I will just start by saying that it was spurred on in part by I was listening to, as I've referenced on this show multiple times, one of my favorite podcasts is Dark Horse with Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather Heying. I just like the way they think, even though they are, I think they would call themselves atheist. Certainly not religious, but they are evolutionary biologists, but I like the way that they think. And on this past episode, I think it was, they had on a couple guests talking about what is called Web3. And I admittedly am not an expert on this, but it's basically like we would say, the internet 2.0 or 3.0 or 4, it's like the new version of the internet that is, kind of on the cusp of coming out. I mean, it'll still be the same internet. It's not like you need to get a new computer and new cell phones it's not like 5G or something like that, or some new kind of internet. But it's a different way of the internet functioning. And so they kind of talked a lot about that, and it's a lot about how the internet now is pretty centralized. Different organizations and institutions have a lot of control over the internet. And so when the internet started with, I guess, what would be like Web 1, it was pretty decentralized and pretty limiting in who had access to it. You had to kind of know how to code and do HTML and all that kind of stuff. But Apple and Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, people who were very tech savvy and wanted to bring this to the consumer market, obviously made computers much easier. You didn't have to run like MS-DOS or any of those kinds of prompts, ways of running computers where you'd have, like the code that you had to type in to get things to do things. You could just click and drag, and made computers much more easy and accessible. And so that's kind of where the web is at, where it's very easy and accessible. Anyone can kind of hop on and do stuff. And if you are somebody who knows how to run some of the machinery behind, we would call these people like hackers or, those kinds of things. People who can kind of look under the hood of the internet, you might be able to do a lot more. It's like jailbreaking your phone almost, and you can do a lot more. But for the most part, most of us don't really know how to do any of that stuff. So we're just kind of at the mercy of the institutions that allow us access to the things on the internet. And so there's this talk of kind of advancing us to Web 3.0 or Web 3, and where it's much more decentralized, and it's, they talk about blockchain, where the internet is much more, decentralized is really the only way to describe it. And in the same way, if you've ever jailbroken your phone, and you might not know what that means, but there's a way to jailbreak a phone which allows you to then, it's basically limitless. Anyone who is a designer and a coder can come up with new ways. If you think, man, it would be really nice if my phone could do this thing, but you're kind of limited because, Apple or whoever, makes your phone, Apple's particularly structured in the way that they've kind of throttled the functionality of their phones and their techs. The example I always give when I talk about this is because I had jailbroken a phone once in the past, and I wasn't necessarily skilled enough to know what I'm doing, and so it wasn't a very good experience, but there was some good things that I learned, and one of them is if you've got an iPhone, you might be familiar with this, but you close an app, and of course the app is not running. It's not running, you're not using it, but it is still running in the background. And I'm sure it's probably still running no matter what you do. But you can, swipe up and it brings up all of your apps that are running, and you can slide up on them and close them out so they're not draining your batteries and your resources and stuff. But you have to just swipe every single one of those. Now, maybe that's intentional because Apple would like you to keep your apps running in the background, so they want to put at least a minimal barrier to keeping you from doing that very often. But you can swipe up on every single one of them and close them out. And I just always think, why don't they just have a button? You just swipe up, hit the button, and it clears all of them out. Well, they probably want you to keep them running. That's one of the main reasons. But when I jailbroke my phone, that was one of the things that you could add onto the phone. So it allows you to do a lot more stuff, and that way it becomes decentralized. Anyone who can code or come up with an idea, or man, wouldn't it be cool if your phone flashed? You could get your I think your phone can now flash SOS, your phone flashlight. But wouldn't it be great if we could get it to flash anything? What if we could get it to strobe to the beat of the music that's going? Anything that a coder might want to think to do, he or she could probably do. And so it really decentralizes. It takes it away from app developers and whoever at Apple kind of restricts what you can do. That's sort of what the web is like right now. You're restricted by what you can and can't do. And they want to take it to the point where it is very decentralized. You can do anything, but security is part of the problem. And obviously, of course, that takes it back to the wild, wild west of the internet. And so there's a concern. So all that to say, listening to that episode got me thinking, and it reminded me of a conversation I had a couple of years ago with a guy when I was installing windshields. We were talking just as we were going to a job, and we were talking about self-driving cars. Teslas were kind of a new thing, and I don't think we had seen it wasn't that we saw a Tesla driving itself or something, but we were just talking about it. Maybe we saw a Tesla, and it just got us talking about self-driving cars. And I had said, in theory, self-driving cars, if everyone drove a self-driving car, so I guess people wouldn't be driving, if everyone owned a self-driving car and that's what drove for them, and already our GPSs, because there's enough people with GPS technology running in their cars, it can detect there's a traffic jam up ahead. With the cameras that exist on cars, they can alert you if you're merging into traffic or whatever. There's enough integration between cars that if everyone drove a self-driving car, traffic jams and accidents and merging, in congestion on highways and stuff, having to detour to avoid accidents, like all of those things would be solved because every car, it would almost be like a hive mentality where the cars, and this is the case I was making to my coworker, all of those problems would be solved because the 1,000 cars in and around you within a mile radius on the highway would all be aware of where every other car is, and it would know if in 5 miles we all need to merge over into the right lane. Isn't that the kind of the perennial problem that plagues us? Is you've got people who merge at the last minute, which causes them to have to squeeze over, which causes a traffic jam. But if every car knew that in 5 miles we all have to merge over, they could all simultaneously slow down maybe a half a mile an hour and adjust so that they could all merge flawlessly, and then there would be no slowdown of traffic. Accidents would be mitigated, and just traffic would just flow a lot better. You wouldn't even need stoplights necessarily, because cars could just integrate and know at what speed they need to go through town to avoid cars. Anyway, from a technological standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. Well, what he had said was, no, man, like, he's like, I wouldn't trust him. I don't trust computers. And I was like, well, what do you mean? And he goes, well, man, anyone could just hack into those computers and just take control of your car and cause chaos or whatever. And I said, well, that's not a problem of self-driving cars. That's a human problem. It's not that you don't trust the machines. You don't trust people. It's the person who's doing the evil thing by hacking into your car. And so we got to kind of talk about human depravity and human sin a little bit. And I thought that is what came to mind when I was listening to, this was a 2.5 hour long podcast with Brett Weinstein and these two Web3 proponents, techs, or I'm not sure exactly what their title or what their profession is, but they are these proponents for this Web3 and really upgrading. And Bitcoin, of course, would play a huge role in this, and blockchain technology and AI would be a huge component to all of this. So all of these technological revolutions that are coming along, people are really nervous about what's going to happen. And I just realized that as they were talking for 2.5 hours, they just kept coming up, well, there could be a problem with this. There could be a problem with that. Yeah, there could be. This could pose a problem. And when we merge AI with Web3, well, this could be a problem, and it could do this, and it could do that. And what I realized is they were having a 2.5 hour long conversation that was very similar to the one I was having with my coworker. It wasn't a problem with the tech, and they kept saying, well, these are just tools. These are tech. This tech is just tools, and that's, of course, true of when we think of cell phones and the damage that's done by cell phones. We'll often blame, depression and antisocial behavior on the cell phone. But then people say, well, it's just a tool. It can be used for good and evil. Like, I can use tech to record the podcast that I'm doing right now and hopefully doing some good with it. But when we talk about, it's going to destroy the world and AI is going to kill everybody, well, what we're really hitting on is the fact that this is a human problem. We're weary of humans. That seems to be the problem. And I was just reminded as I was listening to this episode that and I can't remember who said it, and I tried looking it up. I couldn't find it. But some Christian philosopher was talking about how, and I'm paraphrasing because I couldn't find the exact quote, but that human depravity or human sinfulness is simultaneously the easiest proposition to prove, but it's the hardest to get people to accept. And it's easy to prove because the evidence is all around us. I don't trust self-driving cars. No, you don't trust people with that technology and that tool to not do something evil with it. Well, there's all these worries and concerns about Web3 and AI. No, there's concerns about people and what they will do with that technology. Oppenheimer just came out, and the making of the atomic bomb, and it ends with that. So I guess spoiler alert, skip ahead 30 seconds or so, but it ends, this very famous ending of the movie, with Oppenheimer talking to Albert Einstein, and he had said, I had told you that I thought that we may have brought about the end of the world, and Albert Einstein said, well, did you? Like, what happened, after that meeting? And Oppenheimer says, I fear that we did. I fear that we did basically knock down the domino that's going to end the world. And people will talk about nuclear energy and how good it is and how clean it is. And so you can look at these things and think these are just tools. And scientists could look at these things and say they're just tools. They're just a new advancement in technology. What's the problem? Well, the problem is you put it in the hands of people and they end up dropping bombs on people. they weaponize these things and they turn them into implements of destruction. So our problem isn't with the stuff, our problem is with people. So that evidence is all around us that humanity is utterly sinful. It's obvious within us. I mean, there's nobody knows you like you know you. And so when I self-reflect, this is one of the, I've got several friends who, and myself too, we are a strong proponent, and I am a strong proponent of not viewing Christians as sinful, depraved, sinners, degenerate, worm, unworthy, like that kind of talk seems to be pretty alien to the New Testament and under the New Covenant. We are sinners who are saved, and then we become saints. We are holy, we're righteous, we're blameless in Christ, all of this stuff. That is much more the way that we ought to think of ourselves, but I'm much more amenable to people who have that theology that even as a Christian you are nothing but a no good, rotten, scoundrel, sinner kind of thing. Because I think that's coming from an attitude of, nobody knows you like you know you. You know what parts of your mind, what goes on in your mind, and the thoughts that you entertain, and the things that you do in secret that nobody knows about. You are acutely aware of those things, the things that you are ashamed of. When Paul even says in the New Testament, what benefit do you now gain by doing these things that you were once ashamed of? So there's still this door open for doing these things and thinking these horrendous things that we did before we knew Christ, but they're still there. And so there's this debate on where is this coming from? It's just easy to think that this is just coming from me. It's coming from my sin, my flesh, my wicked nature, my sin, so there's this debate rages on where is this stuff coming from? But the point is that acute awareness of sin, the presence of sin and the depravity of people is there because we know it in ourselves. And that's a lot of the times when we're talking to someone who doesn't know Christ, we can point to the evils of the world. We can point to Hitler. We can point to, communism and a totalitarianism. And we can point to war, and we can point to rape and murder and all this kind of stuff. And we can point to stuff out there. But we as people have a tendency to then say, okay, yeah, sin does exist. People are really bad, but there are some people who are good. Why? Because, well, I'm good. And that, it's hard to get people to believe, even though the evidence is right in front of their face, that, well, you're not good. And I do think so. Tying that into then this idea, and of course we take people to passages like Romans 3, where Paul says, and he's just quoting from the Old Testament. I think this is ironic, given, I'm going to reference a very famous interview that Dennis Prager did very recently, but I'll mention that here in a second. But when Paul says, there's none righteous, not even one. There is none who understands. There is none who seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become useless. There's no one who does good. There's not even one. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and the path of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So he condemns all of humanity. He condemns all people as being sinful. And what's amazing is that you can read that, and if you're honest, that that's true. That, yeah, I am part of all people. When it says all people, I am part of all people. Yeah, I do things that I shouldn't have done. But we fail to realize that the problem goes deeper than that. And I think that a lot of the times we as Christians do think that it is just things that we do, things that we act out, do to other people. And this is part of what Jesus, I believe, was trying to get to in the Sermon on the Mount. And this, of course, came up with, Dennis Prager did an interview that went pretty viral because, if you don't know Dennis Prager, I don't know that he's Orthodox Jew. I don't think he's Orthodox Jew. I think might be Reformed or something. I don't know all the different strands of Judaism, but he is some kind of a religious practicing Jew, and very well versed in Judaism and well versed, so I'm not necessarily picking on that stuff. Although I do think that he is wrong. I mean, he's wrong from a Christian view, but he would acknowledge, and he does acknowledge, that his view and what he's saying Judaism believes is different than what Christianity teaches on this crucial area. And so the very viral interview that he gave, he was talking about pornography and lust and adultery, and he was taking issue with what Jesus said about lust being as bad as adultery or as unrighteous as adultery or whatever. And he was saying, that's wrong. Thoughts are not bad. Actions are bad. So he was trying to make his point and trying to say this is a distinction between Judaism and Christianity, is that Christians will say that your thoughts are wrong. But Judaism says, no, you can. And the example he would use is, what's better if a person thinks racist thoughts and they don't like people of another race and they think that they're better than those people, but they don't act on them and they treat them like equals and they treat them well. Isn't that better than somebody who might think one way but then treat them in a racist way? Well, of course that might be better in the same way that, if you're married and you are lusting after another woman, I don't think your wife would appreciate that, but nobody would argue that she would probably justifiably hate it more if you actually acted on those and slept with another woman. So it is worse. But to say that the bad thoughts, the sinful thoughts, the lusting is not wrong, misses the boat. And he says that this is what Judaism believes. And again, I'm sure Judaism believes 10,000 different things because there's a lot of different strands of religion. But I don't know how he can think that all the way back in Genesis, kind of the quintessential scene in the Bible where God wipes out humanity. Now, this is not to negate the fact that the humans were doing evil. They were definitely doing evil at this time as well. But in Genesis 6, it says in verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind had become great on the earth. So they were acting. But it also says every inclination of the thoughts of their minds was only evil all the time. So their thinking was evil. Now, maybe Prager would say something like, well, yeah, but it's their wickedness that they did. So yes, they were thinking evil, but they were acting on evil. That's what. But God includes the thinking, what's going on in their minds, the thoughts. And this is where I do think that Prager is wrong, because he thinks that, it seems to be that his position is that thinking is not acting. Now, of course, it's not necessarily acting with your body. You're not acting it out. But thinking is an action. When Paul says, now, Prager can say, well, that's not Judaism, but Jesus and Paul and the early Christians were Jews. So I don't know how you can say that that's not Judaism. Certainly some first century Jewish people thought this. When Paul says, take every thought captive, well, why would you do that if the thought itself is not something that you're doing? I mean, how do you take a thought captive? You take a thought captive with another thought. You have to think, and it's in your mind that you're taking that thought captive. So if taking it captive is an action, I mean, that's a verb. You're doing something. You're taking this thought captive. You check yourself in your thinking, and you maybe think something different, or you analyze your thought, or you interrogate your thought. You bring your thought into submission to Christ, all this kind of stuff. These are all actions that we're doing with our thoughts. So even this idea of meditating, when we meditate on God's word, we're thinking, but these are actions. You're not doing anything. You could just be sitting on a couch, eating chips and drinking soda, but you could be meditating on God's word and thinking. And this idea of mulling over God's word and chewing on God's word, we have all of these action words because we're describing something that we are doing. Granted, we're only doing it in our mind, but I think that because Dennis Prager says, well, you're not acting it out, so you're not actually doing it, but you are doing it in your mind. Those are actions. So, sometimes we'll say, when something becomes lusting or whatever, and I don't know that there's a fine line between just admiring an attractive person to where it shades into lust. I don't know where that line is. I don't think there is necessarily a line, but certainly it's all happening in your mind. But these are actions. You're doing something. And even Dennis Prager he talked about, even pornography. Well, you're not acting, you're not committing adultery because you're not acting it out. Well, you are acting it out. If you're watching pornography, you're doing it on a device of some kind. You've picked up the device, you've popped in I guess probably tapes and DVDs are pretty obsolete now, but you've gone on your device, you've searched the website, you've locked your door, whatever it might be that you're doing to secure privacy, you're doing things. These are actions. I don't understand his thinking. And then, of course, he takes issue with Jesus, which I don't understand. I think that Dennis Prager would fall victim to this idea of what was Jesus? The C.S. Lewis, was he a liar? Was he a lord? Was he a lunatic? Was he just a good teacher? Like you can't just relegate Jesus to a good teacher, because if he was just a good teacher, well, if he's a liar, he's not good. If he's crazy, well, we certainly don't listen to crazy people. We don't listen to Charles Manson. Was he just mistaken? Maybe that's an option that C.S. Lewis didn't consider. You can be saying things that are not true, but might not characterize you as a liar. A liar seems to imply intent. You're trying to deceive. Maybe he was just mistaken. But if he's mistaken, he could be a good guy. Maybe Dennis Prager would say, hey, he's a good guy, But you still wouldn't call him a good teacher if he's fundamentally mistaken in his beliefs. So I don't know what Dennis Prager would think of Jesus. He seems to appreciate, he'll talk about Judeo-Christian thinking, and he appreciates Christian thinking and Christian thinkers. Well, how can Jesus be a good teacher if he's fundamentally getting things wrong? But if he's at best a good teacher, well, then he's at least in part representing first century Judaism as a good Jewish teacher. So I don't know what Dennis Prager what does he do with that seemingly contradiction? But this is kind of the quintessential difference and distinction that Prager's trying to make, and what I think Jesus is hitting on is, I think that Dennis Prager is the kind of Jewish person that in Jesus's time needed to hear the Sermon on the Mount. And they had thought, well, if I can just behave as righteously as the Pharisees, then I've got a fighting shot of, getting to heaven or whatever. And Jesus is telling them, when he says, you have heard the ancients say, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. So that would be the Dennis Prager position. As long as you don't act out and commit murder, you can think murderous thoughts all you want. But if you don't act on it, well, then you're good with God. And Jesus says, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the courts. And so he takes that to another level. The example Dennis Prager's speaking of, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. As long as you're not acting it out, that's okay. But Jesus says, I say that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So Jesus is getting the same God in Genesis 6 who's looking down and saying, I see wickedness, but I can see that every inclination of the human mind is only evil continually. I can see their thoughts. And so God is a judge and a discerner of the human thoughts, and he can see, even though you might not act out the depravity, he can see it in the heart. And what Jesus is trying to let us know is that you might think, I'm a good person because I don't act these things out. But you're not a good person just by virtue of thinking about these things. The fact that your mind is prone towards these things. And so when listening to the Web3 people on the Dark Horse podcast and talking with, my coworker and stuff, you begin to realize that there's this glimmer of hope that, well, we know people are good. Well, I'm good. I'm a good person. I would certainly never use AI and these advanced technologies. I would never hack into someone's, automated car and crash it and stuff. So there are enough people out there that that are just good, and if we just I don't know, taught them, educated them, if we were just enlightened enough, we would be able to use these things for good. And yet the conversation inevitably turns to, well, this is going to be used for bad. This is going to be hijacked. This is going to be, we're going to use this for evil. Because there's this underlying, I think, embedded in us, this assumption that no, people aren't good. Depravity exists in every human heart. And even though we might have a Dennis Prager self-righteous attitude of, I don't behave poorly, so therefore I'm a good person, we know intuitively, well, yeah, but I think evil. And you know what? That makes me part of this human race that is depraved, that is utterly depraved. So, as I said at the outset of this episode, I didn't necessarily know where I was going with that, but those are some of the thoughts that have been circulating in my mind, and I've been just trying to pull them into a chord of coherence. And so hopefully I was able to do that. The point being that human depravity is at the bottom of this. And maybe my next episode will be to talk about how we as Christians think that if you just get saved, well, then that solves the problem and the world will just be a better place. And of course, if you're a part of the church or you're a Christian, you know that that's not the case either. And so maybe that's what we'll tackle on the next episode. Well, what role does the Holy Spirit play in the walk of the Christian and in mitigating against some of this fallenness of human nature? So that's the episode for today. I hope you enjoy it. Have a good one. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of mine as a missionary with InFaith, the views and opinions expressed, believed, or lived out by myself or those appearing in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the position, beliefs, or opinions of InFaith as a mission.